I have run this route 11 times since the war ended. The Karev Margin is not a popular stretch. No relay stations, no patrol lanes, no traffic worth mentioning, just 8 light hours of open drift between the Tessin corridor and the outer buoy at Harvin's Point. The kind of space where you run long haul and you do not expect company. I was 2 hours out from Harvin's Point when the signal reached us. My comms officer, a young man named Deccan who still kept a paper logbook for reasons he never explained, looked up from his station with an expression I had not seen on him before. Not alarm, something closer to confusion settling into sorrow. "Captain Voss," he said, "I'm reading a distress broadcast on the general humanitarian frequency. Automated. Cycling. It's been cycling for a long time." I asked how long. He ran the decay calculation and told me 117 days. A signal broadcasting for 117 days. On the general humanitarian frequency. A signal no one had answered, or it would have stopped cycling. I set down my coffee and walked to his station and listened to 11 seconds of it. A recorded voice. The syntactical pattern of an avian species I did not immediately place. Underneath it, a rolling tone that the Universal Distress Codex associates with depressurization emergency aboard a large vessel. "Plot the origin," I said. The origin was 11 degrees off our heading. The vessel was the 8th generation ship Surath's Wing, registered out of a homeworld that no longer existed. I knew the name of that homeworld. Everyone in the shipping lanes did. The Varath blockade had seen to that, 2 years prior. A conflict I will not detail here except to say it ended badly and irrevocably for the Aethan. The Galactic Compact had convened 3 sessions on the matter, and produced, at the conclusion of those sessions, a formal classification. The surviving Aethan population, then estimated at somewhere between 5 and 8,000, constituted a non-viable remnant, ineligible for resettlement corridor assignment, for humanitarian aid routing, for provisional asylum consideration under the Compact Charter. 14 member species had voted in favor of that classification. 1 had abstained. Earth's representative had left the chamber before the vote and filed a formal protest in writing, which was noted in the record and ignored. I turned to my navigator. Adjust heading, intercept course. He did not question me. Neither did Deccan, or my engineer Hala, who appeared in the doorway because she had been listening from the corridor. My crew knows who I am. They knew before I said another word. It took us 4 hours and 20 minutes to reach the Surath's Wing. What I saw when we came alongside her is not easy to describe economically. She was a generation ship, built not for speed but for endurance, for carrying an entire people across long distances in relative dignity. She had also been drifting, unpowered, for at minimum 3 months. Her hull bore the scoring of an engagement I could not date. One of her 2 primary drive assemblies was dark, the other produced a faint cycling pulse, the ship attempting to restart itself on a repeating timer, failing, and trying again. Her observation windows were lit in a patchwork pattern, power rationed zone by zone to keep the inhabited sections warm. She was still alive. After 117 days of sending a signal into a silence that answered nothing, she was still alive, and her people were still aboard, and the ship was still trying. I hailed on the distress frequency. The response came in 40 seconds. The voice that answered was old. I could hear it in the register, in the measured cadence of someone who had learned a long time ago not to waste breath on panic. He identified himself as Elder Navigator Sorath Vel, senior surviving officer of the Sorath's Wing. He asked, in the clipped formal syntax of Aethan high speech, what vessel was hailing and what its intentions were. I told him my name, my ship, and my registry. I told him we were independent, not compact affiliated, not military. I told him we had heard their signal. There was a pause of several seconds. Then he said, "How long have you been in range of our signal?" I told him, 4 hours and 30 minutes. Another pause. Longer. "We have been broadcasting," he said, "for 119 days. "I know," I said. "I'm sorry it took this long. We're going to help you. Tell me what you need most." What they needed most was atmospheric seals on decks 9 through 14, which had been losing pressure at a slow enough rate that it had not been immediately fatal, but had been pushing the population steadily toward the forward compartments for weeks. They needed water reclamation repair. Their primary recycler had failed at day 60, and they had been running on emergency reserves. They needed medical supplies, because they had sick and injured they had been managing without adequate pharmacological stock since day 40. And they needed, when all of that was addressed, a navigation solution, because the Suroth's wing could not make transit under her own power, and had no destination to transit to in any case. I called Hala up from the engine room and put her on the line with their engineering team. Our cargo hold held a mixed manifest: construction hardware and waystation ration stock, not a rescue kit. But there were sealant compounds Hala confirmed would patch the pressure breach, ration units we could transfer, and medical stores I have always carried in excess of what regulations require, because 20 years in these lanes teaches you why. We did what we could with what we had. I sent a compressed transmission to the nearest relay with a full situation report: vessel ID, population count. Final census aboard the Suroth's wing was 6,214 individuals, of whom 340 were in acute medical need. Position, condition, and resource requirements for full evacuation and resettlement. I flagged it Priority 1. I addressed it to the Earth Humanitarian Routing Office, in addition to the standard compact emergency channel, because I had learned over 20 years of running these lanes exactly which addresses actually generate a response. I will not detail the next 6 days in full. I will say that on the second day an Earth relief vessel came out of transit at the edge of sensor range and began closing on our position, and then a second, and then on the fourth day a converted hospital transport that had no business making the transit this fast, meaning someone on the routing end had pushed the drive schedule harder than regulations strictly permitted. When those ships began to appear on the Suroth's wing's long-range sensors, the Aethan made sounds my translator could not render. Not words, but something prior to words. Something that lives in the body before language arrives to name it. On the sixth day, Elder Navigator Sorath Vel came aboard the Callow Ridge. He was tall, as the Aethan tend to be, taller than any of my crew, and built along angles that take some adjustment to read, the way a heron takes adjustment if you have only ever watched sparrows. His plumage was gray, fine-textured, with the remnant markings of a navigator's cast along the leading edges of his folded wings. Markings, I had read, that the Aethans spend decades earning. He moved carefully through my corridors, the way large beings do in spaces not built for them. He did not speak until we were in my cabin, door closed, seated across from one another at the small table where I eat my meals and sometimes play cards with Decan when the runs are long. Then he looked at me for a while. He had very still eyes, the kind of eyes that have watched a great deal of loss without being destroyed by it, which is a specific kind of steadiness I have learned to recognize because it takes work to maintain. He reached into the fold of his flight robe and produced a primary feather, gray-tipped, long, the sort of feather that sits at the outermost edge of the wing. He set it on the table between us with both hands. A formal gesture. I did not know its precise meaning, but I understood its weight. He spoke then, in Aethan, not high speech, not the formal register he had used over the comm. Something older, something that ran lower in the throat. My translator gave me nothing. The words did not map. He sat for another moment after he finished speaking. Then he stood, inclined his head in a way that conveyed something my vocabulary cannot hold, and left. I logged the encounter in the ship's record. Elder Navigator Sorath Vel came aboard at 0900, departed at 0941. Exchange conducted in part in Aethan, untranslatable. What he said was not logged. What he meant did not need to be. I picked up the feather. I have it still. We cleared the Karev Margin 11 days later, the relief convoy ahead of us, and the Suroth's wing under tow, heading for a station where asylum was, for the first time in the Aethan's recent history, not a closed question. I do not know how it resolved, only that it was not fast, and not without difficulty, and that the compact's classification sat in the official record like a stone no one quite knew how to move. But I know the Suroth's wing made it to dock. I know 6,214 people walked off that ship onto a pressurized surface. And I know that somewhere in the records of the Earth Humanitarian Routing Office, there is a Priority 1 flag from a cargo freighter that stopped because the signal was there and no one else had. That flag is not a monument, not meant to be. It is just what you do when you hear the signal.